The Constellation was a very good airliner. To ensure that they stayed in front of the competition, Lockheed continued development of the Constellation, resulting in the Model 1049, or more commonly known as the Super Constellation. The prototype, which interestingly was the original Constellation prototype that had been rebuilt to the new specification, had taken to the air for the first time on the 13th of October 1950, and the first production model rolled off the production line during the middle of the following year. The new Super Constellation had some 550 design changes made, and even before the prototype had taken to the skies, 62 examples of the Super Constellation was on order from 5 airlines. This would reach to be over 100 by the time the first production model rolled off the production line, making it one of the biggest backlogs of orders in Lockheed's history. The main upgrade for the new Super Constellation over the older model was that it had its fuselage stretched by some 5.59 meters. The vertical stabilizers were lengthened to accommodate the increasing length, and it could accommodate anywhere from 65 to 102 passengers, depending on configuration. An extra fuel tank could be fitted in the wing center section to help boost the range, and the windows were changed from porthole design to be square with rounded corners. The interior was also redesigned, and it is said the Super Constellation was the first of its kind to introduce air conditioning, reclining seats, and extra lavatories. Ailerons were also updated to be metal covered. However, the first Super Constellation model had its issues. Powered by updated Wright R-3350 CA1 duplex cyclone engines boasting some 2,700 horsepower, it was found to be underpowered, and when compared to contemporaries such as the DC-6, it struggled. It had been planned to give the new Model 1049 the more powerful Wright Turbo Compound engine. However, development delays meant that it was not ready when the Super Constellation was launched. Lockheed only received orders for 24 Model 1049s, 14 to Eastern Airlines and the other 10 to TWA. Eastern Airlines also adopted to not have the extra fuel tank to be installed in the wing center section, although the airframe was still built with space for them. The Wright R-3350 Turbo Compound engines were upgraded duplex cyclone engines, being much more powerful. It was designed in a way that it was able to utilize the exhaust gases from the engine to power 3 high-speed turbines that then connected back to the engine via hydraulic couplers, providing extra power. This is quite a crude description of them, and it is probably pretty obvious here that my background is not overly a technical background. Anyway, the turbo compound engines had the benefit of providing around 20% extra power, and hence could allow for higher maximum takeoff weights. There were also limitations with these engines though. As it generated greater engine noise, there was a greater level of complexity to the engine, and on early Super Constellations, flames would flow out of the exhaust, something that required modifications to the wings to protect them, and no doubt was a sight that would stir concern and fear among passengers. Eastern Airlines were the first to utilize the new Super Constellations, opening them on the New York to Miami route on the 17th of December 1951. The baseline Model 1049 evolved into the Model 1049A and B, which was specifically for the military. They were powered by the new turbo compound engines, but more on these a little later. The Model 1049C was the first Super Constellation commercially available to be powered by the turbo compound engines, with the Wright R-3350 DA1 being the selected power plant. These were capable of producing some 3,250 horsepower each. Other refinements included additional structural strengthening, revisions to the landing gear retraction system, passenger doors, and improved soundproofing. The first test flights of the 1049C began in February 1953, with it entering commercial service the same year. KLM were the first to operate this model, and with the Super Constellation became the first airline to offer a direct, non-stop route across the Atlantic between New York and Amsterdam, and it only being non-stop if flown eastbound. 48 of the Model 1049Cs were built and found service with a range of airlines around the world, including Eastern Airlines, Air France, KLM, TransCanada, Qantas, Pakistan International, and Air India. The next model in the Super Constellations lineup was the 1049D, which was a civilian version of the military Super Constellations, and were built specifically for seaboard and western air. The D model had cargo doors both fore and aft of the wing on the port side of the fuselage and a reinforced floor, and they had the unique feature of being able to quickly change from cargo configuration to seating to carry 109 passengers. At the time, it was the largest cargo transport available for commercial operations, with it even being capable of carrying some 20 racehorses in their own stalls, water, hay, and feed for them all. Only 4 of this model were ever built, with deliveries to Seaboard and Western Air occurring in 1954. The E model was very similar to the C model, except with a higher gross weight of the D model. 28 was still built, and some C models were retrofitted to the E model standard. The first E model variant was flown on the 6th of April 1954, however it was quickly made redundant when at the end of the same year Lockheed released plans for the 1049G model. Consequently, some 7 airlines who had the E model on order changed their orders to the improved G model. Those airliners that did take delivery of the E model, in many cases had it retrofitted to bring it up to standard with the G model. KLM was one such airline who converted 4 L1049Es to G configuration in March-June 1956. Perhaps the best of the Super Constellations was the Model G, also known as the Super G. The G model brought in a series of new changes, perhaps most majorly the fitment of wingtip fuel tanks to help compensate for the extra fuel burn of the turbo compound engines, while also increasing the range of the Connie by another 1,125 kilometers. Engines were updated and upgraded to the R-3350 DA3, capable of producing some 3,400 horsepower. Soundproofing was once again improved, and other improvements came in the form of upgraded de-icing systems. By now, cloud and collision warning radar was being installed to both new aircraft as well as those already in service. However, there was still some persistent issues with the turbo compound engines, most notable of which was the excessive amount of flames that would shoot out of the exhaust, and if the aircraft was climbing, it is said the flames would reach as far back as the trailing edge of the wing. This no doubt was far from ideal, as the flames would negatively impact the structural strength of the wing, while seeing flames shoot out of an engine was not a sight any passenger wanted to see. It took Lockheed some 9 months to try and fix the flaming issue, during which hundreds of flight tests were flown, and not after some $2 million had been thrown at it. Other issues with the engines included chronic nozzle box cracking and cooling cap failures, and in general, the turbo compound engines were considered high maintenance and demanded a fair bit of attention. In late June 1955, the newest version of the Super Constellation was unveiled, the L1049H. The H model was designed to be both a cargo aircraft and passenger aircraft, with it being capable of converting from cargo to passengers in a mere matter of hours. That also meant that the H model had the freight doors and heavy-duty flooring of the D model. The H model would to begin with have the same maximum gross weight of the Super G, but this was increased from 137,500 pounds to 140,000 pounds with the introduction of the EA6 variant of the turbo compound engines. Qantas was the first airline to order the new model, introducing the type into service during September 1956. Along with 2 L1049Es that were converted into freighters, Qantas utilised the L1049H to open freight services from Sydney to London. In all, some 59 L1049Hs were built, operating with a wide range of airlines that included TWA, KLM, Pakistan International, Trans-Canada, and 3 ended up in the hands of the Indonesian Air Force. The ability to convert between cargo and passengers were especially useful in the ability to lease the aircraft to different operators. For example, in 1956, Seaboard and Western Airlines leased their L1049Hs to Eastern Airlines to help accommodate the extra demand during the Christmas period. The L1049H would mark the end of the development of the Super Constellation design. Looking to expand range and be able to fly non-stop back and forth over the Atlantic, Lockheed in 1955 did start designing what would be known as the Model 1649A Starliner, or as it was originally known, the Superstar Constellation. Ultimately, a further development of the Constellation line. Taking the Super Constellation design, the Starliner would feature a completely redesigned wing, allowing the engines to be moved further away from the fuselage, and thus reduce noise in the cabin, and the fuel capacity was upgraded. The engines were kept as the turbo compounds. It was first flown in October 1956, with deliveries beginning April the following year. A show of its impressive range was that Lufthansa's first 1649A was delivered to Hamburg, Germany, flying non-stop from the Lockheed factory at Burbank, California. However, the 1649A couldn't compete in the jet age that was beginning, and production would even end before the L1049H. Only 44 1649As were built. The Constellation would hang around into the early 60s, and by then, newer and more efficient airliners were beginning to appear, and as such, airlines started to retire them from service. However, on the second-hand market, there was still great demand for the Connie, and it would soldier on through the 70s and even some into the 80s with various companies. Now we move on to the military application of the Super Constellation, which ended up being quite vast and a long career. It is also quite complicated, with many different designations and a handful of aircraft being one-offs. Impressed with the POW-1, the Navy placed an additional order for 6 PO-2W machines in July of 1950. While the PO-1W had been based off the Constellation, the PO-2W was to be based off the Super Constellation, receiving the Lockheed designation of L1049A. The PO-2W was fitted with a radome above the fuselage and a second one in a belly radome that housed radars similar but slightly different in dimensions to the PO-1W. Furthermore, there was the addition of weather navigation radar, which was housed in an extended nose. The PO-2W had a cargo door installed on the rear left side of the fuselage and carried some 12,000 pounds of equipment, while being powered by the R-3350 Turbo Compound engines. Redesignated WV-2 before the first was delivered to the Navy, eventually the order snowballed out to 244 WV-2s, of which 142 were delivered. The WV-2 was the first Super Constellation to introduce wingtip fuel tanks, which allowed the aircraft and its crew to fly for as long as 30 hours. Crew numbers were to range from 28 to 32. The Navy introduced the type into service towards the end of 1955, and by 1958 had a total of 4 squadrons operating the type. The WV-2 would mainly be enrolled in the very important airborne early warning role, patrolling up and down the coastline of the United States, keeping lookout for any possible enemy activity, before retiring in August 1965. The designation was further changed in 1962 to EC-121K due to a decision to introduce standardized aircraft designations among the services of the US military. Furthermore, the Navy had 8 of the WV-2s converted to WV-2Q standard, later redesignated EC-121M, which allowed them to undertake specialized signals intelligence work. The Air Force would also operate the L1049A in a similar role to the Navy. 72 of the 244 WV-2s on order for the Navy were transferred to the Air Force before delivered, and with the Air Force they had the designation of RC-121D. In 1962, the RC-121D received the designation of EC-121D. The WV-2E was a one-off experimental aircraft utilized by the Navy to test a rotating radome. Then there was the WV-3, later redesignated WC-121N, with which 8 were built and one more being a converted WV-2. These were designed for weather reconnaissance missions with a crew typical of 11, although this number could reach 23 for longer missions. Here they were utilized for general weather reconnaissance missions, as well as tracking and flying into hurricanes. They remained in service until the early 1970s. 22 WV-2s were upgraded to have limited anti-submarine warfare abilities and redesignated as the EC-121Ps, operating out of Iceland. Beginning in 1962, the Air Force upgraded 27 of the EC-121Ds and 7 ex-Navy EC-121Ks, becoming the EC-121Hs. The EC-121Hs were capable of utilizing and working in a semi-automated ground environment network. This network allowed for radar stations to feed data directly into control centers, which then acted on the data to send interceptors towards intruders. Then there were the 5 EC-121Ds and 1 EC-121H machines that were upgraded to become the EC-121Qs. However, little is known about their work. There was the EC-121Ts with a total of 23 machines being upgraded to this standard. These featured upgraded equipment and uprated R-3350 engines. Finally, during the Vietnam War, some 40 ex-Navy machines were given to the Air Force, where they were fitted with new equipment that was designed to allow for them to detect enemy movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operating out of Thailand between October 1967 and December 1970, these aircrafts received the designation EC-121Rs. They were nicknamed Batcats and were painted in a camouflage scheme, making them the only Super Constellations to wear camouflage. The AL-1049B arose from the Navy's need for a long-range cargo aircraft, receiving the Navy designation of R-7V1 and then later C-121J. These aircraft had dual cargo doors, one fore and the other aft of the wings, a reinforced cargo floor, and the ability to be quickly converted from a cargo configuration to a configuration capable of carrying passengers. They were capable of transporting up to 106 passengers or 73 stretcher cases and 4 medical attendants. Again, these were powered by the R-3350-91 engines. The first R-7V1 took to the skies in November 1952, and the Navy originally put in an initial order for 11 machines. This would eventually rise to 50. Of the 50 R-7V1s ordered, 33 machines were transferred across to the Air Force during June of 1958, where they received the new designation of C-121G. Another 10 R-7V1s were built as airborne early warning aircraft and delivered to the United States Air Force, receiving the designation of RC-121C, later being changed to EC-121C. They were not as capable as the WV-2s or the RC-121Ds, and more or less seemed to act as an interim aircraft as the Air Force awaited the delivery of the RC-121D. Once the RC-121D came online, the RC-121Cs were withdrawn to the training role, receiving another new designation, TC-121C. When developing the Super Constellation, Lockheed had looked at the possibility of changing the power plant to a turboprop. The Navy had also shown interest in this area, and as such, beginning in 1954, the Navy started to take delivery of the R-7V2, a transport aircraft powered by the Pratt & Whitney YT-34P12 turboprops. This model received the Lockheed designation of Model 1249A and boosted being able to carry much greater payloads at much faster speeds. However, these 4 aircraft were purely evaluation aircraft to allow the Navy to evaluate turboprop aircraft, and thus no more were ever produced. 2 did end up with the Air Force, receiving the designation YC-121F, and 1 headed back to Lockheed to undertake trial work on the Allison T-56 turboprop engine. And although Lockheed did experiment and trialed turboprop installations on the Super Constellation, no versions ever appeared on the civil market. That brings us to an end of all the major variants utilized by the American Armed Forces. There are a number of one-off specially modified Super Constellations as well. These included a handful of machines that were modified to have radio and TV broadcasting equipment, and another one-off was the VC-121E Columbine 3, a converted R-7V1 completed to be a VIP transport. From August 1954, this aircraft was then US President Eisenhower's own plane, and when flying on board had the call sign of Air Force One. In service with the military, the Super Constellation provided significant service, particularly as an airborne early warning system, allowing for the US to greatly improve its early warning systems. Furthermore, throughout the Vietnam War, the Super Constellations would provide important work assisting strike packages heading into hostile airspace. By the end of the 1960s, the Super Connies were beginning to disappear from military service, although some will soldier on into the 70s, and the last Navy aircraft hung around until 1982. The Super Constellation represented the very best of piston engine aircraft. A lovely, elegant aircraft, the Constellation family helped allow for commercial aviation to significantly expand in the post-war era. Today, there is still a handful of Super Constellations on display around the world, as well as 2 in airworthy condition. One is located in Australia, painted in Qantas colours and operated by the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society, while the other is based in Basel and operated by the Super Constellation Flyers Association. The Super Constellation was an aircraft that showed the potential of piston airliners and represented the very best in its class. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure to go leave a like and subscribe for future videos. In the meantime, keep flying high.